Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Worst Case Macchiato. It is now episode 5. What's going on, Madison?
Not much. You?
A lot. We started moving the past couple days. I moved my mom up north, and it's been a crazy couple days. The house was not move-in ready, so we were cleaning a lot the first day. We couldn't even get in until like 5, 6 p.m. So we spent 4 hours that day cleaning, but we couldn't move anything in. So
That is brutal.
yeah, so it was like a complete wash of a day. And like we had movers, so they were moving all like the heavy stuff, so we didn't ever have to like do any heavy lifting. So like the first half of the day we're like, wow, we feel useless. But then the second half of the day it was just scrubbing walls, scrubbing the floors, like everything was like this stuff that the amount of stuff that it was on the walls and the floors was ridiculous, but um is what it is in the life of switching houses. And I only just set up my computer this morning. Like, kid you not, I set it up like 2 hours ago. So it was a very busy morning for me. But, and then we're here for literally, I'm only here for like a week and a half, and then I have to move back down to London. So it's gonna be a crazy few
That's
weeks for me.
yeah, that's totally fair. Like the only thing for me is I just completed the course that I was doing, so that's like a huge, like relief for me. Um, Now that that's finished, so now it's just really putting more emphasis into the podcast, and then obviously, hopefully, looking for a new job. I've applied to jobs, and hopefully something good comes out of that. But other than that, I've been enjoying not having to do schoolwork for the past few days.
True. I I'm not ready for the swing of schoolwork to come back again. Just because the courses I took, I assume it's going to be a lot of reading for them because it's a lot of like psychotherapy and uh, learning about psychoses and stuff. So it'll be very tough, I think, this semester, but it'll be okay. Um,
Yeah, that's totally fair. Like I just got the email saying that I passed everything and that I got my diploma or micro diploma, whatever it's called, for the course that I was doing. So that's super exciting. And then I also just want to quickly reference and say, if I sound like shit, I'm not using a proper mic yet. We will get there hopefully in the near future. But um, yeah,
yeah, it'll happen eventually. It's just a matter of accumulating the amount to get a decent mic, and then going
yeah.
through
So I just
the
apologize
process.
to everybody, and I don't sound as good as Vanessa because I'm just using a gaming headset with a built-in mic. So we're just rocking that until we can get a proper mic.
Yeah, and I already had one just because I was hoping to do some like gaming streams and stuff, and I only did a little bit and then I stopped. So that's the only reason why I even have one. But my case is a long case today. I don't know if you switched yours from what we were hoping to cover or not, but mine is a really long case.
Okay. Yeah, I did switch mine. I am not doing the one that's on our list.
Okay, is it super long?
Uh, I don't think it's that long. So, I mean,
Okay,
like my notes are still like 8 pages, but it's a lot of like just kind of skimming over stuff. Like it's not a super crazy case.
right. Mine's pretty long. So buckle up because it's a long, crazy roller coaster ride.
All right, I'm excited.
So today I did stick onto our schedule-ish that we set up. So I am doing Charles Manson. So he was
Yes.
born Charles Miles Maddox on November 12th, 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio. Just to let everyone know, he was a Scorpio. His mother was Ada Kathleen Maddox, who gave birth to him when she was only 15, and his father was Colonel Walker Henderson Scott Sr., who was 9 years older than his mother. So his father actually had a local reputation as a con artist, and he never actually met him ever in his life. He left before he was born. He allowed Charles's mother to believe that he was an army colonel, but actually the name colonel was actually just his given name, so he wasn't in the army at all. Which is it's a weird
Cool.
name to give somebody, but apparently
Yeah,
that's what it
definitely.
was. But then when Ada told Colonel that she was pregnant. He said that he was away on army business, but months after he did not return, she realized that he was never going to come back. So in August 1934, before Charles was born, his mother married William Eugene Manson, who was 10 years her elder. He was a laborer at a dry cleaning business. So she definitely liked older men, very clearly. She often went on drinking sprees with her brother Luther, therefore leaving Charles with a multitude of babysitters between the ages of, when he was born all the way up to age 9. And then on April 30th, 1937, Ada and William divorced after William alleged that Ada grossly neglected her duty as a mother to Charles. And then after the divorce, Charles retained the surname Manson, hence why we know him now as Charles Manson. August 1st, 1939, Ada and Luther were arrested for assault and robbery, and they were sentenced to 5 and 10 years imprisonment respectively. And when they were arrested, Charles was sent to live with his aunt and uncle in McMecken, West Virginia. Ada was paroled in 1942, and Charles mentioned that the first few weeks after his mother's return were the happiest time in his entire life. But then a few weeks after her release, after they moved to Charleston, West Virginia, Ada returned back to heavy drinking, and Charles decided to stay home, and he never went to school. So then Ada was eventually arrested again, but she wasn't convicted, and this was for grand larceny, which is, for people who don't know, is unlawful taking or stealing of another's property. And then after she was not convicted, they later moved to Indianapolis, where Ada met alcoholic Lewis Cavender Jr. through Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA, and later married him in August of 1943. So that's just kind of a background of his childhood, how it kind of, how his family life kind of played into who he is. So now I'm just going to go into his adult life before forming the cult that he is mostly known for. So in an interview, Charles said that his first crime that he ever committed was when he was 9 years old, and he said that he set his school on fire. In 1947, when he was 13, Manson got in trouble for missing school and petty theft, and he was placed in the Gabault School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana, which was a school for male delinquents run by Catholic priests. Gabault was a strict school where punishment for even the smallest infraction included beatings with a wooden paddle or a leather strap. Charles ran away multiple times from Gabault, and he slept in the woods, under bridges, pretty much anywhere he could find shelter, as long as he didn't have to go back to Gabault. He ended up spending Christmas of 1947 with his aunt and uncle back in McMecken, after which his mother found out and returned him to Gabault, and then he ran away again 10 months later. In 1948, in Indianapolis, he robbed a grocery store, and at this grocery store, his main goal was to just get food so he could eat, but when he found a cigar box containing over $100, he stole the money. When he took the money, he rented a room in Indianapolis, in their Skid Row district, and he also bought food. So this was mainly for necessity.
So how old was he when, during his first offenses, roughly?
So when he set fire to his school, he was 9, and then petty theft started when he was roughly around the age of 13. So he was still 13 when he robbed the grocery store. So he was still under the age of 15.
Which is crazy young to start crime, but okay. Anyways.
Yeah, well, it just reminds me of some movies and TV shows, or I guess in real life too, but where people will steal from grocery stores or steal from restaurants and whatever for bread, right? That's just because you need that. At age 14, 50, he was trying to live a life without crime. Even though he did steal, it was basically for necessity. So he wasn't doing anything malicious in his mind. But at age 14, 15, he had a job delivering messages for Western Union, which is a financial services company, but he quickly began to supplement his wages through petty theft. So he wanted more money, so he started stealing things so he could have more money. But he was eventually caught, and in 1949, a judge sent him to Boys Town, which is a juvenile facility in Omaha, Nebraska. After 4 days at Boys Town, he and a fellow student named Blackie Nielsen obtained a gun and stole a car, and then they committed 2 armed robberies on the way to Peoria, Illinois, to the home of Nielsen's uncle, who was a professional thief, and Nielsen's uncle allegedly took them both under his wing and kind of taught them the way of thieving, I guess. Charles was arrested 2 weeks after arriving in Illinois during a nighttime raid on a Peoria store. In the investigation, he was linked to the 2 earlier armed robberies he did with Nielsen. After being arrested, he was sent to the Indiana Boys School, which is a strict reform school. At this school, he was allegedly raped by other students with the encouragement of a staff member, and he was repeatedly beaten. He ran away from the school over a dozen times. Some sources say that it was up to 20. And then at the school, he developed this self-defense technique he later called the insane game, where whenever he was unable to defend himself, he would screech, grimace, and he would wave his arms in a crazy way to convince people that he was insane. So they would kind of like back off of him. He officially ran away from the school with 2 other boys in the February of 1951 when they were 17 years old. The trio robbed gas stations while attempting to drive to California in stolen cars, and they were arrested in Utah. In the United States, driving a stolen car over state lines is a federal crime, so they were sent to Washington, D.C.'s National Training School for Boys, and on arrival, it was determined that Charles was illiterate because he never went to school, but he had an above-average IQ of 109, and I did look it up. The average IQ is roughly around 100, so like even though he had no schooling, he was still above the national average. And then his caseworker also deemed him as aggressively antisocial. And then, like imagine if he like grew up in a situation where he did go to school regularly and it wasn't like an unstable environment. Just imagine what he could have done with his life.
Yeah.
But in October 1951, upon recommendation from a psychiatrist, Charles was transferred to Natural Bridge Honor Camp, which is a minimum security institution. He had a parole hearing scheduled for February 1952. However, in January, less than a month before his parole hearing, he was caught raping a boy at knife point. He was then transferred. He was then transferred to the Federal Reformatory in Petersburg, Virginia, where he committed 8 serious disciplinary offenses, 3 of which involved homosexual acts. He was then transferred to a maximum security reformatory at Chillicothe, Ohio, where he was expected to remain until his release on his 21st birthday in November of 1955. He was granted an early release in May of 1954, though, due to good behavior, and when he was released, he went back to McMecken and lived with his aunt and uncle. In January of 1955, he married a hospital waitress named Rosalie Jean Willis, and in October later that year, his pregnant wife and him moved to Los Angeles in a car that he had stolen in Ohio. And so since he committed the same federal offense as when he did years earlier, he was charged again with driving a stolen car over state borders and was given 5 years probation after a psychiatric evaluation. So he wasn't imprisoned for it. He failed to appear at a Los Angeles hearing on an identical charge filed in Florida, which resulted in March 1956. His probation was revoked, so then he was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment at Terminal Island in Los Angeles, a low-security prison for male inmates. While Charles was in prison, his wife gave birth on April 10th, 1956, to their son, Charles Manson Jr. In 1957, when the visits from his wife stopped, his mother informed him that his wife was living with another man. And then 2 weeks before a scheduled parole hearing, once again, he tried to escape by stealing a car. And then he was given 5 years probation in September of 1958, but his parole at the parole hearing was denied. That same year, Rosalie received a decree of divorce. By November 1958, he was pimping out a 16-year-old girl while receiving additional support from a different girl who had wealthy parents. And in September of 1959, he pleaded guilty to a charge of attempting to cash a forged U.S. Treasury check, which he claimed to have stolen from a mailbox. The charge of stealing someone else's mail was later dropped, but he was still charged with trying to cash the forged check. He
You said he was pimping out
a
a
16-year-old.
16-year-old.
Yep.
Jeepers.
Yeah,
Alright.
that's not the first time. I'm just gonna let you know. He received a
Not
10.
surprised.
Yeah. With how it goes later on, no one's surprised. So he received a 10-year suspended sentence and probation after a young woman named Leona Candy Stevens, who had an arrest record for prostitution, made a tearful plea before the court about the two of them being madly in love and that they would marry if Charles was ever freed. So, for anyone who doesn't know, a suspended sentence is when a court charges someone with an offense but defers the serving of the offense with a period of probation, and if no crimes are committed in this probationary period and no terms of the probation are broken, then the sentence is usually considered to be fulfilled. So before the end of the year that they did marry, it is speculated that they only married so that she wouldn't have to be required to testify against him if he was ever to be charged and go through court process again. But then Charles took Leona and another woman to New Mexico for purposes of prostitution. Again, pimping people out, resulting in him being held in question for violating the Mann Act, which is an act that made it a felony to engage in interstate or foreign commerce transport of any woman or girl for the purpose of prostitution or for any other immoral purpose. So he was released after this charge of violating the Mann Act, but then he disappeared. When he disappeared to go to Mexico, it was in violation of his probation, and a bench warrant was issued, and an indictment for the violation of the Mann Act followed in April of 1960. So then he was arrested in June in Laredo, Texas for violating his probation and was ordered to serve his 10-year sentence for the check cashing charge. So since he committed another crime during this probationary period, he had to go back to serve his sentence. So he spent a year unsuccessfully challenging the appeal of his probation, even though the rules of the probation were very clear. And then in July 1961, he was transferred from the Los Angeles County Jail to the United States Penitentiary at McNeil Island in Washington. In 1963, Leona was granted a divorce, and during the process, she alleged that she and Charles had a son, and this second son of Charles Manson is also called Charles Manson. So he has two sons, both called Charles Manson. So I just want to make that clear.
Jesus.
Yeah, I don't know the middle name of the first one from Rosalie, but Leona's son is named Charles Luther Manson. In June 1966, he was sent for the second time to Terminal Island in preparation for early release. And by the time of his release day, that was scheduled for March 21st, 1967, he had spent more than half of his 32 years in prisons and other institutions. He told authorities that prison had become his home, and he requested permission to stay in prison, but was denied.
Why would you want to stay in prison? Like, I know that it's become home for him because he spent so much time there, but who in their right mind, clearly not in a right mind, would ask to stay in prison?
There's actually like quite a few criminals I have like looked into and like watched documentaries for that have asked to stay in prison or said that like, you cannot let me out because I will do things out there that you do not want me doing, and they eventually get released and they eventually doing the crimes that they do, killing people,
like,
raping
I get
people.
that, but like, I don't know.
So, but yeah, like, no, obviously, like, if somebody asks to stay in prison, like, maybe it's a sign that maybe they should be staying in prison. Like,
Yeah.
right? So now it's the beginning of his belief in Scientology and how he formulated his cult. So Manson began studying Scientology while incarcerated in 1961 with fellow inmate Lanier Rayner, and in July of 1961, he listed his religion as Scientology. Upon his release in 1967, Manson reportedly met local Scientologists in Los Angeles and attended several parties for movie stars. And Charles's later right-hand man, Bruce Davis, worked at the Church of Scientology headquarters in London from November 1968 to 1969. Less than a month after his release, he moved from Los Angeles to Berkeley, which is a small city on the edge of San Francisco, California. After leaving Los Angeles, his probation officer transferred the supervision of Charles to criminology doctoral researcher and federal probation officer Roger Smith. And until the spring of 1968, Smith worked at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, known as HAFMC, which Manson and his family went to frequently while in Berkeley. Roger Smith and the HFMC's founder, David Smith, received funding from the National Institute of Health and apparently also the CIA to study the effects of drugs like LSD and meth on what is called the counterculture movement in the Haight-Ashbury area. So the counterculture movement included only groups that were anti-establishment, so people who didn't want to associate with the government. So these were people such as the people who create cults, and then obviously it was the 1970s, so it was like the hippie culture. The patients at the clinic quickly became subjects of both Smith's research, including Manson and his growing group of mostly female followers. And it was noted that the effects that LSD had on Manson was the most abrupt that Roger Smith had ever observed in his entire professional career. So Manson was inspired by the developing free love philosophy in Haight-Ashbury, that he began preaching his own philosophy based on a mixture of a book written by Robert Anson Heinlein called Stranger in a Strange Land, the Bible, Scientology, Dale Carnegie, and also the Beatles. He quickly became acquainted with Mary Brunner, a 23-year-old graduate from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She was working as a library assistant at the University of California, Berkeley, and moved in with her. He then met Lynette Fromm, a runaway teen, and convinced her to move in with him and Brunner. And even though at this time she was the first person to move in with him and Brunner, but Brunner was really resistant at the beginning, but then eventually Manson was able to manipulate her and she overcame her initial resistance. And before long, they were sharing Brunner's women, and he mostly targeted individuals for manipulation who were emotionally insecure and social outcasts, which is very typical in cult culture. Because I
really hope that was a big ass house.
I have no idea, like it didn't say the address or anything, so I have no idea how big it was, but they didn't live there for long. Manson quickly established himself as a guru in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, and Manson's group was characterized as believing that Satan would come reconciled to Jesus and they would come together at the end of the world to judge humanity. And the group was quickly called the Manson Family by prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi and the media. And Manson allegedly taught his followers that they were the reincarnation of the original Christians and that the establishment could be characterized as the Romans. In 1967, Manson began using the alias Charles Willis Manson. And by the end of summer of 1967, Manson and some of the women began traveling by an old school bus they had renovated, and eventually they settled in Los Angeles areas such as Topanga Canyon, Malibu, and Venice along the coast. And then on April 15th, 1968, Mary Brunner, which was the original girl whose house they were living at, gave birth to her and Charles' son, whom she named Valentine Michael. Manson was arrested again on July 31st, 1967 for attempting to prevent the arrest of one of his followers. And instead of Manson being sent back to prison, the charge was actually reduced to a misdemeanor, and Manson was given an additional 3 years of probation. He avoided prosecution again later, also in the same month, while moving from San Francisco to LA with the permission of Roger Smith, when his bus crashed into a ditch and police found all of the people that were on the bus sleeping naked. So he was arrested and released only a few days later, this time from a drug charge. In April of 1968, Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys was driving through Malibu when he noticed two female hitchhikers And he picked them up and dropped them off at their location. And then a few days later, he noticed the same two girls hitchhiking again. And so this time he took them back to his house on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. When Wilson went to a recording session the next day, he came back to his house with Manson standing in the driveway. And Wilson and Manson quickly became friends. So Manson and his followers ended up moving into his house on Sunset Boulevard. And it's supposed to be this huge mansion. I just want to make that clear. He was leasing it from a landlord. And so it was him and Manson and all of his followers were living in the same house. While they were living with Wilson, the Manson family destroyed Wilson's Ferrari and his Mercedes-Benz, and they ended up stealing the Mercedes-Benz the next year, and they drove it to a mountain outside the Spahn Ranch. Wilson eventually distanced himself from the Manson family, and he moved out of the house, leaving everyone else behind there. And they were eventually evicted from the house from the original landlord a couple weeks before Wilson's lease was up. So when they were evicted, Manson established a base for the family at the Spahn Ranch, which is a 55-acre movie ranch in LA, which was decommissioned for any movie sets because it was extremely run down. And the female family members did chores around the ranch, and occasionally they had sex on Manson's orders with the nearly blind 80-year-old owner, George Spahn, and the women also acted as guides for him.
Hold the phone for a second.
Yeah.
He made the women sleep with this 80-year-old owner of the mansion?
Of the ranch.
Of the ranch.
Yeah.
What in the...
Yeah, and he was nearly blind, so like they either would guide him around, kind of like almost like guide dogs, or they would have sex with him whenever Manson asked. And in exchange, yeah.
I was like, what is he getting? What is Manson getting in return of this? Like just the satisfaction of watching young women have sex with an 80-year-old? Like what is...
So in exchange, the 80-year-old owner allowed Manson and his group to live at the ranch for free. So basically, he gets to have sex whenever he wants because Manson will force the girls to do it, and they get to live there rent-free. So that's basically what that is. Around this time, now that they have a official base and they aren't like moving around anymore, this is kind of when they start going on their huge crime spree that everyone knows about. So it started in 1969. Tex Watson, which was one of the members of the Manson family, he was involved in drug dealing, and he robbed a 22-year-old drug dealer named Bernard Lotzapapa Crow. And Crow...
That's quite the name.
It's quite a nickname, that's for sure. Crow allegedly responded with a threat to kill everyone at Spahn Ranch. In response, Manson shot Crow on July 1st, 1969. Happy Canada Day in 1969. At Manson's Hollywood apartment. So I guess Manson had a Hollywood apartment then. Manson's belief that he had killed Crow was seemingly confirmed by a news report of the discovery of the dumped body. And although Crow was not a member of the Black Panthers group or whatever, he concluded that he had been in and expected retaliation from the Panthers group. But when he returned to Spahn Ranch into a defensive camp, he established night patrols by armed guards. So he would have all like the guys be the armed guards of the camp. This is when it becomes super defensive and no one's allowed to be anywhere near where they are. Tex Watson, which was the one that was involved in drug dealing, later wrote that Blackie was trying to get at the chosen ones. So Bernard Lotzapapa Crow was black, so basically just playing on race and saying that he was trying to get at the chosen ones because they believed they were born again Christians, right? And then he also brought in members of Straight Satan's motorcycle club to act as security for the ranch as well. And then the next crime they committed was called the Hinman murder. So 34-year-old Gary Allen Hinman was a music teacher and a graduate student at UCLA. He befriended members of the Manson family in the late 1960s, sometimes allowing people from the Manson family to stay at his home. And according to Manson family member Susan Atkins, Manson believed that Hinman was actually really wealthy, and he sent family members to the home on July 25th, 1969, to convince him to join the family and to turn over all the assets to Manson that he thought that Hinman had inherited, which he didn't. So the three held Hinman hostage for 2 days as he denied having any money. And then during this time, Manson arrived with a sword, slashed Hinman's face and ear. After that, one of the girls stabbed Hinman to death, allegedly on Manson's instruction, before leaving the Topanga Canyon residence. One of the girls used Hinman's blood to write "Political Piggy" on the wall and to draw a panther paw, which is a Black Panther symbol. So they were trying to make it as, I don't know if you know much about like the crimes that they committed, but they tried to make it seem that it was a race war between the blacks and the whites. So they were trying to say that the Black Panther group of this like drug group or whatever was trying to attack Hinman, which was a white man. That they were like acting out of retaliation. According to Manson and one of the girls in the group, they said that Manson went to Hinman's to recover money paid to Hinman for mescaline provided to straight Satans that had supposedly been bad. And mescaline is a psychedelic drug, if people were unaware of what it was. And one of the female family members added that Brunner and Atkins, unaware of his intent, went along to visit Hinman. So they were just saying that, like, since they wanted to get money back from the bad drugs that they gave to the straight Satan's group that they were paying for security, they went there and like whatever, and they wanted to get his money or whatever. And then so eventually this one female member was arrested on August 6, 1969, and they were caught driving Hinman's car. And then the police found the murder weapon in the tire well. So it was just a huge like backstory on, oh, they needed to do this, and he created this huge fabricated story of why Hinman needed to die, but didn't tell them the exact reason on why he wanted him to die. Like, it was just an all-around weird story. And then we come to the Tate murders, which on the night of August 8th, 1969, Tex Watson, which is the guy from the first killing, the drug dealer, took Susan Atkins, Linda Caspian, and Patricia Krenwinkel, which they were all members of the family, to the Tate residence. Watson later claimed that Manson had instructed him to go to the house and totally destroy everyone in it, and to do it as gruesome as you could. And then obviously Manson told the women to do the same as Watson. The occupants that were at the house that evening were 26-year-old movie actress Sharon Mary Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant and was the wife of film director Roman Polanski, her friend and former lover, 35-year-old Jay Sebring, a noted celebrity hairstylist, Polanski's friend, 32-year-old Wojciech Frykowski, and Frykowski's 25-year-old girlfriend, Abigail Ann Folger, heiress to the Folgers, like the Folgers coffee fortune, and daughter of Peter Folger. Also present on the property were 19-year-old William Garrettson, the caretaker, and his friend, 18-year-old Stephen Earl Parent. Polanski was in Europe working on a film, so he actually wasn't there. And then somebody else, a music producer named Quincy Jones, was a friend of Sebring who had planned to join him that evening, but he didn't actually go. So that was a called by the bell moment where he was lucky he wasn't there. But Tex and the three women arrived at the house just past midnight on August 9th, 1969. Watson climbed a telephone pole near the entrance gate and cut the phone line to the house. The group backed their car to the bottom of the hill that led to the estate, walked back up to the house. They thought that the gate might be electrified or equipped with an alarm, so they climbed a brushy embankment to get onto the grounds. And then headlights approached them from within the property, and Watson ordered the women to lie in the bushes. He stepped out, ordered the approaching driver to stop. Stephen Parent had been visiting the property's caretaker, who lived in the guest house. And Watson leveled a .22 caliber revolver at Parent, who begged him to not hurt him, claiming that he wouldn't say anything. But then Watson lunged at Parent with a knife, giving him a defensive slash wound on the palm of his hand that severed tendons and tore the boy's watch right off his wrist. Then he shot him 4 times in the chest and abdomen, killing him in the front seat of his white 1965 AMC Ambassador coupe. Watson ordered the women to help push the car up the driveway. Which, I'm sorry, like, after I kill them, I'm not pushing the car back up the driveway. Like,
yeah, no.
like that's just like
On somebody else.
It's obviously like a hill, right?
Yeah.
So then Watson next cut the screen of a window and told one of the girls to keep watch down by the gate. She walked over to parents' car and waited. Watson removed the screen, entered through the window, and then the other 2 girls went through the front door. He whispered to the girls, and then he awoke Frykowski, who was sleeping on the living room couch. Watson kicked him in the head. Frykowski asked him who he was and what he was doing there. Watson replied, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." And then, on Watson's direction, Atkins found the house's 3 other occupants with Krenwinkel's help and forced them to the living room. Watson began to tie Tate and Sebring together by their necks with a long nylon rope which he had brought, then slung it over one of the living room's ceiling beams. Sebring protested the murderer's rough treatment of the pregnant Tate, so Watson shot him. Folger was taken momentarily back to her bedroom for her purse, and she gave the murderers $70. Watson then stabbed Sebring 7 times. Like, oh my gosh, thank you. Like, he already shot him, and then he went back and stabbed him 7 more times.
Yeah, I'm just baffled. Like, I don't even know what to say. Like, what is happening?
There's some weird backstory. After everyone's dead here, I'll go back to a crazy beginning of this whole Tate nonsense. So Frykowski's hands had been bound with a towel, but he freed himself and began struggling with Atkins, who stabbed at his legs with a knife. He fought his way out the front door and onto the porch, but Watson caught up with him, struck him over the head with the gun multiple times, stabbed him repeatedly, and shot him twice. Sabian had heard horrifying sounds and moved towards the house from her position in the driveway. She told Atkins that someone was coming in an attempt to stop the murders. Inside the house, Folger escaped from Krenwinkel and fled out a bedroom door to the pool area. But Krenwinkel pursued her and caught her on the front lawn, where she stabbed her and tackled her to the ground. Watson then helped kill her. Her assailants stabbed her a total of 28 times. Frykowski struggled across the lawn, but Watson continued to stab him, killing him, and Frykowski suffered 51 stab wounds and had also been struck 13 times in the head with the butt of Watson's gun, which bent the barrel and broke off one side of the gun grip, which was recovered at the scene. In the house, Tate pleaded to be allowed to live long enough to give birth and offered herself as a hostage in an attempt to save the life of her unborn child. But Atkins and Watson stabbed Tate 16 times, killing her. The coroner's inquest found that Tate was still alive when she was hanged with the nylon rope, although the cause of her death was determined as a massive hemorrhage, while in Sebring's murder it was found out that he was hanged lifeless. According to Watson, Manson had told the women to leave a sign, something witchy. Atkins wrote "pig" on the front door in Tate's blood, and then Atkins claims that she did this to copycat the murder scene of Gary Hinman in order to get Manson family member Bobby Busele out of jail, who was in custody for the murder. Busele wrote "political piggy" in Hinman's blood on the wall after stabbing him to death, which was the murder that I talked about of Gary. So this Tate encounter all began like 2 years earlier on March 23rd. So Manson originally entered the grounds, which he had known as the Melker's residence. So it was somebody completely different who was living there now. But he wasn't invited there. He just showed up, and he approached the main house, and he was met by a photographer who had befriended the owners of the main house, which was Roman Polinsky and Sharon Tate. And so when Manson was approaching, the photographer had gone onto the front porch to ask him what he wanted, and Manson said that he was looking for Melker. The photographer didn't even recognize the name, and so the photographer said, go around to the guest house, maybe they know who it is, or maybe that's who's living there, I don't know. So then he went back to the back of the house later that evening, and he knocked on the door, and it was actually the owner who lived there that owned the entire property. I guess the other people were like renting or leasing the front. So he was in the back house, and so he just come out of the shower. Manson again asked for Melker, but he thought that maybe he was actually asking for him. It actually was discovered that Manson had apparently been to the property multiple times earlier before that day asking for Melker, even though Melker was no longer there. And then Altobelli told Manson through the screen door that he believes that he probably moved to Malibu and that he didn't know the new address, although he did. Like, so he actually knew that his new address, but he obviously wasn't going to give it to him. The owner told Manson that he was leaving the country the next day, and Manson said that he would like to speak with him upon his return, but he said, I'll be gone for more than a year. I don't know the exact date I'll be back. And so Manson said that he was directed to the guest house by the people in the main house, and the owner said, don't bother my tenants. And then that owner and Sharon Tate, who was in the main house, flew together to Rome the next day, and Sharon Tate actually asked him whether that creepy looking guy had gone to see him at the guest house the day before or not. So he was already at that house, so I assume it was probably a retaliation for them not telling him where Melker's new address was.
Interesting.
Yeah, so then there's still a few more other murders. I'm kind of gonna try to get through them as much as I can. So next one is called the La Bianca murders. The 4 murderers plus Manson went for a drive the following night. Manson was allegedly displeased with the previous night's murders, so he told Kasabian to drive to a house at a specific address in the Los Feliz section of Los Angeles, and located next door to a home where Manson and the family members had attended a party the previous year. It belonged to a 44-year-old supermarket executive, Lino LaBlanca, and his 43-year-old wife, Rosemary LaBlanca, co-owner of a dress shop. Watson had complained to Manson earlier of the inadequacy of the previous night's weapons. Watson sent the women from the kitchen to the bedroom where Rosemary LaBlanca had been returned. While he went to the living room and began stabbing Lino LaBlanca with a chrome-plated bayonet, the first thrust went into his throat. Watson heard a scuffle in the bedroom, and he went in there to discover Rosemary keeping the women at bay by swinging the lamp tied to her neck. He stabbed her several times with the bayonet, then returned to the living room and resumed attacking Lino, whom he stabbed a total of 12 times. He then carved the word "war" into his abdomen, and then Watson returned to the bedroom and found Krenwinkel stabbing Rosemary with a knife from the kitchen, and Van Houten stabbed her approximately 16 times in the back and the exposed buttocks. Van Houten claimed at trial that Rosemary was already dead during the stabbing. Evidence showed that many of the 41 stab wounds in total that she had been inflicted post-mortem.
41.
Yeah.
Oh.
And then Watson cleaned off the bayonet and showered, while Krenwinkel wrote "Rise" and "Death to Pigs" on the walls, and also wrote "Helter, Skelter" on the refrigerator door, all in La Bianca's blood. She gave Lino LaBianca 14 puncture wounds with an ivory-handled 2-tin carving fork, which she left jutting out of his stomach. She also planted a steak knife in his throat. And all while they're doing these killings, Manson drove the other 3 family members who had departed Spawn with him that evening to the Venice home of the Lebanese actor Saladin Nader. Manson left them there and drove back to Spawn Ranch, leaving them and the LaBianca killers to hitchhike home. And
nice.
Yeah, and according to Kasabian, Manson wanted his followers to murder Nader in his apartment, but Kasabian claims she thwarted this murder by deliberately knocking on the wrong apartment door and waking a stranger. The group abandoned the murder plan and left, but Atkins defecated in the stairwell on the way out. So she literally just shat. She just pooped on the stairwell.
What a way to go.
And left. Yeah. Which, I mean, compared to the rest of their crimes, like whether you shit on the stairs or not, who cares? And then the last murder that they know for sure that the Manson family did was the Shea murder, which was 35-year-old Hollywood stuntman Donald Jerome Shorty Shea was murdered on August 26, 1969, only a couple days after my dad was born. More than
I
two
was gonna say
weeks.
that's around your dad's birthday.
Yeah, more than 2 weeks after the Tate LaBianca murders, when Manson told Shay, Bruce Davis, Tex Watson, and Steve Grogan to go on a ride to a nearby car parts yard on the Spawn Ranch. According to Davis, he sat in the back seat with Grogan, who then hit Shay with a pipe wrench, and Watson stabbed him. They brought Shay down a hill behind the ranch and stabbed and brutally tortured him to death. And apparently, Bruce Davis actually recalled this at his parole hearings. And he said that he returned back to the ranch and he said, "Are you satisfied, Charlie?" And then he turned and walked away. And he said that he was sick for about 2 or 3 days and he refused to even think about what he had done. In December of 1977, Shay's skeletal remains were discovered on a nondescript hillside near Santa Susana Road next to Spawn Ranch after Grogan, one of those who were actually convicted of the murder, agreed to aid authorities in the recovery of Shay's body by drawing a map to its location. According to the autopsy report, his body suffered multiple stab and chopping wounds to the chest and blunt force trauma to the head. And so there are a number of people who were suspected to be murdered by them. I'm not going to go into the whole story of how many stab wounds they had. I'm just going to say the names of them and their ages. So Nancy Warren, age 64, Clyda Delaney, age 24, murdered on October 13th, 1968. Marina Elizabeth Habe, age 17, murdered on December 30th, 1968. Darwin Morrill Scott, age 64, on May 27th, 1969. Mark Waltz, age 16, on July 17th, 1969. John Philip Zero Hott, age 22, in the summer of 1969. James Sharp, age 15, and Doreen Gall, age 19, on November 17th, 1969. Reed Jervertson, age 19, November 16th, 1969. Joel Pugh, age 29, December 1st, 1969. Ronald Hughes, age 35, in November of 1970. November 8th, 1972, age 26-year-old James Lambert Thompson Willett. Lawrence Merrick, age 50, on January 26, 1977. And then 6 months after the death of Merrick, Mignano's sister, Michelle Mignano, age 21, was found on June 13th, 1977. So those were all the people that they assumed were killed by the Manson group. But they obviously don't have enough evidence to fully convict them. So for the investigation, I'm just going to try to get through this as quickly as I can, just because I'm already at pretty high in time. But the Tate murders became national news on August 9, 1969, and the Polanski's housekeeper, Winifred Chapman, arrived for work that morning. And on August 10th, detectives of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, which had jurisdiction in the Hinman case as well, informed the LAPD detectives assigned to the Tate case of the bloody writing at the Hinman house. According to Vincent Bugliosi, which was the prosecutor that I noted in the beginning who called them the Manson family, he said that because detectives believed that the Tate murders were a consequence of a drug transaction, the Tate team initially ignored this and other evidence of the similarities between the crimes. On August 12, 1969, the LAPD told the press it had ruled out any connection between the Tate and LaBianca homicides. On August 16th, the Sheriff's Department raided the Spawn Ranch and arrested Manson and 25 others as suspects in a major auto theft ring, which had been stealing Volkswagen's Beetles and converting them into dune buggies. Weapons were seized, but because the search warrant had been misdated, the group was released a few days later. In a report at the end of August, the LaBianca detectives noted a possible connection between the bloody writings at the LaBianca house and the singing group The Beatles' most recent album. Still working separately from the Tate team, the LaBianca team checked with Sheriff's Office in mid-October about possible similar crimes. They learned of the Hinman case and also learned that the Hinman detectives had spoken with Busole's girlfriend, Kitty Lutzinger, who had been arrested a few days earlier with the members of the Manson family. So following up leads a month after they had spoken with Lutzinger, LaBianca detectives contacted members of a motorcycle gang Manson tried to recruit as bodyguards, which was that skull group that I was talking about. But meanwhile, a dormitory mate of Susan Atkins informed LAPD of the family's involvement in these crimes. So Atkins ratted the entire family out by talking about it to people she was living with, and she was booked for the Hinman murder after she told sheriff's detectives that she had been involved in it. She was transferred to Sybil Brand Institute, a detention center in Monterey Park, California, where she had begun talking to bunkmates Ronnie Howard and Virginia Graham, to whom she gave account of the events in which she had been involved. And then on December 1st, 1969, the LAPD announced warrants for the arrest of Watson, Krenwinkel, and Kasabian in the Tate case. The suspects involved in the LaBianca murders was noted. Manson and Atkins, already in custody, were not mentioned. The connection between the LaBianca case and Van Houten was also among those arrested near Death Valley, but they hadn't been recognized yet. Watson and Krenwinkel were already under arrest, with authorities in McKinney, Texas, and Mobile, Alabama, having picked them up on notice from LAPD. They were informed that a warrant was out for her arrest, so Kasabian voluntarily surrendered to authorities in Concord, New Hampshire on December 2nd. There was physical evidence such as Krenwinkel's and Watson's fingerprints, which had been collected by LAPD at the house of the Tate murders. It was augmented by evidence recovered by the public. On September 1st, 1969, the distinctive .22 caliber high standard Buteline special revolver Watson used on parents Sebring and Frykowski had been found and given to the police by Stephen Weiss, a 10-year-old who lived near the Tate residence. In mid-December, when the Los Angeles Times published a crime account based on information Susan Atkins had given her attorney, Weiss's father made several phone calls, which finally prompted LAPD to locate the gun in its evidence file and connect it with the murders via ballistics tests. Originally, Judge William Keene had reluctantly granted Manson permission to act as his own attorney because of Manson's conduct, including violations of a gag order and submission of an outlandish and nonsensical pre-trial motions. The permission was withdrawn before the trial's start. Manson filed an affidavit of prejudice against Keene, who was replaced by Judge Charles Older. On Friday, July 24th, the first day of the testimony, Manson appeared in court with an X carved into his forehead. He issued a statement that he was considered inadequate and incompetent to speak or defend himself and had X'd himself from the establishment's world. Over the following weekend, the female defendants duplicated the marks on their own foreheads, as did most of the family members within a day or so. The prosecution argued the triggering of Helter Skelter as Manson's main motive. The crime scene's blood white album reference Helter Skelter, written by Susan Atkins, and the writings of pigs was correlated with testimony about Manson's predictions that the murders Black people would commit at the outset of Helter Skelter would involve in the writing of pigs on walls in victims' blood. The defendants testified that the writing in blood on the walls was to copy that of the Hinman murder scene, not an apocalyptic race war. According to Bugliosi, Manson directed Kasabian to write a wallet taken from the scene in the women's restroom of a service station near a Black neighborhood. However, as co-prosecutor Stephen Kay later pointed out, the wallet was actually left about 20 miles away in a predominantly white neighborhood. And then he kept denying the court's permission to question prosecution witnesses. Despite precautions taken by the court, Manson flashed the jury. Los Angeles Times front page, whose headline was "Manson Guilty, Nixon Declares." This was in reference to Richard Nixon, who was the president at the time, decreed what he saw as the media's glamorization of Manson. So it was anti-establishment his entire life, and he continued that all throughout the prosecution, all throughout until the day that he died. And he died on November 19th, 2017, and he was age 83, and he died in Bakersfield, California. He didn't have any other children. He just had those 3 children, and his final convictions was first-degree murder. So he had 7 counts of first-degree murder, and he also was charged with conspiracy to commit murders. His criminal penalty was death, and then was commuted to life imprisonment. And his main partners, obviously, were the members of the Manson family, but Tex Watson was a really huge member in the case. And then also he had his right-hand man that I talked about earlier, and then also the females of Atkins, Brunner, and Kasabian. When he was being held at the way that he died was it was on January 1st, 2017. He was originally being held at Corcoran Prison, but he was rushed to Mercy Hospital in downtown Bakersfield because he had gastrointestinal bleeding. So this was obviously told. TMZ found out. They reported that his doctors considered him too weak for surgery, so he wasn't able to have surgery, and so he was returned to prison. And the nature of his treatment was never disclosed. But then on November 15th, like I said, he had returned to the hospital in Bakersfield, and that is when he died. And it turned out that this gastrointestinal bleeding was caused by colon cancer. And then Manson's grandson, Jason Freeman, stated his intent to take possession of Manson's remains of personal effects. But Manson's pen pal, Michael Channels, claimed to have a Manson will dated February 14, 2002, which left Manson's entire estate and Manson's body to Channels. So Manson's family didn't even get his remains after he died. I mean, if my family member did what he did, I don't think I'd want them. But hey, I'll tell ya. And then there's obviously a ton of fiction inspired by Manson, as well as there's a whole bunch of documentaries. But I'm not going to go into them because there's one almost every year since 2003, and it would just take too long to say. But yeah, so when I said it was a long case, it was really long. So
yeah, probably could have been like its own episode.
Yeah, like I was doing the research into it, and I'm like, wow, this really could have just been on its own. But I am ready to give my voice a break and just listen to you for a bit, though.
All right, sounds good. So the case that I'm covering today is called The Orphaned on the Ocean. So the story is about a young girl who was found alone on a raft after a mysterious yacht accident. Her family goes missing, and it's just a strange and tragic tale. So Arthur Duperrault had always dreamed of taking his family on a sailing trip on the Azure Seas. He would look out and watch the cold water on Lake Michigan and recall the warm waters of the far south that he had sailed during World War II. He was an optometrist from Green Bay, Wisconsin. He had a goal of living on a sailboat for a year and touring around the world. In 1961, Duperrault had earned enough money to make the dream happen, or at least part of it. Instead of facing the harsh Wisconsin winter, so Arthur, age 40, his wife Jean, age 38, son Brian, age 14, daughters Terry Jo, 11, and Renee, 7, would head to the Bahamas for a week. They made arrangements to spend a week giving life at sea a go on a chartered yacht and extend a sabbatical if they enjoyed life on the sea. So they traveled to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where they rented a two-masted sailboat that was called Bluebell. And they hired a man by the name of Julian Harvey. He was 44. He was a former Air Force fighter pilot and an experienced sailor to captain the ship. Harvey's wife, Dean, would join the group on the cruise. On the morning of November 8, 1961, the Duperraults boarded the Bluebell to begin their eagerly awaited journey to the Bahamas. As the sails filled on the Bluebell, it appeared to fly and sailed gracefully from dark waters into the green of the open sea, and finally the deep blue of the Gulf Stream, the mighty river in the sea that passes between Florida and the Bahamas. As they approached the horizon, they could see a stretch of sea containing many islands. It basked in 100,000 square miles of sun-washed seas, holding the promise of fulfillment for the Duperrault family's adventure. Over the course of the next 4 days, Harvey piloted the Bluebell east towards a small island chain of Bimini. Then they went further east to Sandy Point. They also went to a village on the southwestern tip of the Great Abaco Island. And then the group spent their time snorkeling, gathering shells on white and pink beaches early on the Sunday. So they sailed out on a Wednesday, and it's now Sunday. So Duperrault and Harvey stopped by the office at Sandy Point Village to talk to Commissioner Roderick W. Pinder to fill out the forms for leaving the Bahamas. and returning to the US. So I guess you had to like stop, fill out forms so you could return to your country. Duperrault said this has been a once in a lifetime vacation. He told that to Pinder. He said, "We'll be back before Christmas." That night, Dean prepared a dinner of chicken cacciatore and salad, and it was the last meal ever served on the Bluebell. Around 9 p.m., Terry Jo, so she's their first daughter, but the second of the kids, she headed below deck to her sleeping quarters in a small cabin at the back of the boat. Ordinarily, her sister would sleep in there too, but on that night, she remained with her parents and brother on the deck in the cockpit. In the middle of the night, Terry Jo was awakened by her brother yelling, "Help, Daddy, help!" She also heard brief running and stomping noises. Then silent, she laid in bed, shaking, disoriented, and terrified. About 5 minutes later, she crept out of her cabin and saw her mother and brother lying crumpled in a pool of blood in the main cabin, which functioned as a kitchen and dining room during the day and was converted to a bed at night. She knew right away that they were no longer alive.
Wait, so she walked out. Wait, they're on a cruise ship, right? That's what you said?
They're on a sailboat.
Oh, sailboat. And it's just, is it just four of them, or is there like staff on board?
So there's the staff that's on board would be the obviously the pilot. So um, the one that I mentioned earlier, Julian Harvey, that they had hired to captain the boat.
Right?
His wife was on board, and she was also basically like doing the cooking of the meals and stuff.
Right?
And then there was Arthur, his wife, and their 3 kids. So there was 7 of them on board.
And
Yeah,
then randomly they wake up to the wife and one of the children dead, but no one else is dead.
yeah.
That's so weird.
At at this point, yeah,
That's so weird. Okay.
yeah. So slowly she climbed. Terry Jo climbed the stairs and stuck her head out of the hatch. She saw more blood pooled on the starboard side of the cockpit, which is the right hand side, and possibly what she believed was a knife. She climbed on the deck and turned toward the front of the boat. Suddenly, Captain Harvey lunged at her and shoved her down the stairs and told her to get back down there.
A
And he like
motherfucker. I'm
growled,
sorry.
right,
Oh my god.
right.
How
So
old
her
is she?
heart
How
was.
old is she?
So Terry Jo's 11.
Oh my god. Even worse.
Yeah.
Like,
So Terry Jo's heart was pounding. She looked away from her mother and her brother's bodies. She returned to her sleeping quarters and crawled into her bunk. She then heard sloshing. Soon, an oily smelling water seeped into her cabin and covered
no.
the floor. She realized the ship was filling with water, but she was afraid to move. Suddenly, she saw the captain's dark form silhouetted in the cabin's doorway. He had something in his hands, possibly her brother's rifle, and stood looking down at her. The only sounds in the room were of his heavy breathing, the thundering of her heart in her ears, and the slap of the rising water against the bulkheads. The captain turned away and walked out of the cabin. She heard him climb the stairs back to the upper deck. Water started to become coming over the top of her mattress. Terry Jo knew she had to abandon the cabin. She waded through the waist deep waters to the stairs. She climbed to the top again. From the light of a bulb on the boat's main mast, she saw the ship's dinghy and rubber raft were floating beside the boat on the port side, which I believe is the left side.
Mhm.
She yelled, "Is the ship sinking?" Harvey shouted yes. Coming up from behind her, he pushed the line to the dinghy into her hands. He said, "Hold this," he shouted. She was numb from shock. She ended up letting the line slip through her fingers. So the dinghy started to kind of float away from the sinking Bluebell.
Mhm.
Harvey jumped overboard to catch it. Harry Jo watched him swim away after dinghy, and he disappeared into the night.
Oh my god. He was just like, he just like probably wasn't able to. swim to it, I guess, right? He probably would have been like, because he was never found,
Yeah.
right?
So we'll get to that.
Okay. Also,
So
I just want to go back to the cabin situation. So she's in the cabin. It's filling up with water. The captain opens the door, stares at her, breathes in the room, and then walks away.
yeah,
That's so weird. So creepy. Like,
right.
I was like so bewildered by that. I was like, what the heck? Like, he basically just wanted to make sure that she was there. That was so weird.
Yeah. And then so she remembered that there was a cork life float that was kept latched to the top right side of the main cabin, which was now just barely above water. So she scrambled to the small oblong float and quickly untied it. Just as it came free, the boat deck sank beneath her feet into the ocean. She was half crawling, half swimming. She pushed the float into the open water. She climbed onto the float. One of its lines snagged on the sinking ship. For a breathless moment, Terry Jo and the float were pulled underwater as the bluebell went down. The line then came free, and the float and Terry Jo on it popped back to the surface. She huddled low on the float, afraid that the captain might be lying in wait for her in the dark waters because she didn't know where he had gone. So then she had no water, no food. She was only wearing her thin white blouse and pink pants. Nothing to protect her from the chill of the night. The moon had set and heavy clouds denied her even the light of the stars. She could hear the moan of the wind, but couldn't see anything. Waves came out of nowhere with no warning. The salt water was stinging her eyes and lips. A sudden shower drenched her and she began to shiver uncontrollably. One thought began to kind of occupy her mind was, where is my father? Um,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Where is the father in
and
all this? That's a good question.
yeah, and even like her younger sister is not really mentioned. So the next morning, a Monday, the sun drove the chill from Terry Jo's slender body, but she quickly realized it would bring a great danger. As the day progressed, the temperature quickly rose to 85 degrees. Because remember, like she is in the Bahamas,
Right.
and the sun began to scorch her. The flimsy float was beginning to disintegrate, exposing her legs and feet to the sharp teeth of parrotfish. With each passing hour, her tongue became drier and her throat more parched. Even so, she had no appetite and wasn't thirsty. On Tuesday, a small red plane circled overhead. She watched it and waved at it for a long time with her blouse, and at one point it dived in her direction and she waved frantically, her heart pounding with hope. The plane passed directly over her, close enough that she could see the details of its underside at an angle, but that made it impossible for the pilots to see her. So then she knew that her chances were slim that somebody in a passing plane or boat would see her. The float was white. She had her blouse and she had blonde hair. She said it would just make her look more like a white cap along the multitude that were already on the sea.
Right, yeah.
She was floating in the northwest Providence Channel, which soon would drift north into the Gulf Stream and then east, carrying her across the wide Atlantic to the British Isles. Earlier that afternoon, she saw ghostly shapes about 30 yards from her float. Just beneath the water surface, her heart caught in her throat. The shapes came closer, and she could see they were porpoises, which are small toothed whales with like a low angled dorsal fin. Like when you look at them, like they're pretty small. They look to me they look similar to like a beluga whale, like but even smaller than that. They stared up at her with large dark eyes. She felt oddly comforted by the whooshing sounds the creatures made as they came to surface to breathe. She said a little prayer of thanks to God for sending them. They remained close by her for hours. As the sun broke through the clouds in late afternoon, she splashed water over her scorched, tightened skin. Cool forests of Wisconsin and the cold waters of Green Bay seemed so far away. The sun dropped and finally sank below the horizon. Tuesday night, she brought back an awful unknown in the darkness, but it also brought blessed relief to her body. As the float rose and fell on the waves that third cold night, she dreamed that she was in the cockpit of an airliner coming in for a landing. She saw the long, straight, converging lines of iridescent landing lights standing out with a surreal brilliance against a phantomless, flowing blackness. In her dream, she saw her father seated peacefully with a glass of wine. Even though she never tasted wine, it looked refreshing, just what she needed to quench her thirst. And she heard his voice call out, "Come on, Terry Jo, we're leaving." They dawned bright and clear. It grew hot quickly. The glare of the sun caused her dry eyes severe pain. Her muscles ached, her skin burned through her blouse and pants. Her lips were rough and swollen. For most of the time, she had to balance rigidly on the edges of the unsteady float, because much of its rope webbing had already broken away. She started to hallucinate. She imagined a tiny desert island complete with solitary palm trees. She tried paddling toward it, but it disappeared. Finally, she fell unconscious. When the sun rose on Thursday, she did not feel its burning rays. She was in a deep sleep close to the threshold of death. Walls of water came at her one after another. Her raft was lifted to the tops of steep cliffs, then lowered into dark valleys. Only the faintest spark of life flickered. By mid morning on the fourth day, alone on the raft, she emerged from her stupor and opened her eyes. A huge shadow loomed before her like a great beast. The rumble was so deep that she could feel its pounding rhythm in her chest. As she watched, it seemed to metamorph from an unworldly vessel floating above the sea into a great whale, and then into a solid black wall suspended in the air above her. When she looked up to the top of the great wall, she saw heads and waving arms. She could faintly hear voices shouting. Finally, she felt herself suspended in space. Strong arms lifted her up slowly as she slid back into oblivion. So she was rescued by a boater that located her. When Julian Harvey was hired as a skipper of the Bluebell, not a lot was known about his earlier life. The 44-year-old was a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel married to Mary Dean Jordan, an aspiring writer and former TWA flight attendant. The day after the Bluebell went down, the lookout on a Puerto Rico bound oil tanker spotted a small wooden dinghy floating in the middle of the broad and deep Northwest Providence Channel. When the captain pulled the tanker closer, a man in the dinghy yelled, "My name is Julian Harvey. I am master of the Bluebell." So he was located.
Oh, that motherfucker.
Uh,
Oh,
right,
oh,
right.
oh man. No, no way. He like, so he
But like he
literally.
had a dinghy and like he had like a proper, like boat and he had like, things to survive.
Oh,
So, and also, like, he was found a day after. So, like, he was only out there for like a day on his own.
wow. Well, I guess he
Yeah.
obviously would have told them about the girl that was alive. I guess, right?
Yeah. So, also, like, when the boat, like, rescued him out of the dinghy, he had the lifeless body of the younger daughter, Renee.
Oh,
Because after he escaped, he claims that her body was seen floating, so he figured he would take it and try and perform life-saving measures on her and try to revive her, but it didn't work. So he, out of respect for everybody, he decided that he would keep the body and try to get to shore with it so that they could, say their goodbyes and stuff and the family could have like closure kind of thing. Um,
right. That's the story.
yeah, that's his story
Right.
anyways.
Okay.
So,
So we know
um,
that we know that the dad and the younger daughter most likely died then.
well, so we know for sure that right now that the mother and
Son and
brother
the young
and
daughter.
the younger daughter are dead. Yeah. So, in the days that followed, Harvey told the Coast Guard in Miami that he was the sole survivor of a grave accident. In the middle of the previous night, he reported a sudden squall damaged the sailboat. His wife, Dean, and the Duperraults were injured when the masts and rigging collapsed. Gas lines in the engine room ruptured and the ship caught fire as it slowly sank. Harvey said he had managed to launch the dinghy and a raft and dive overboard, but tangled rigging trapped everyone else on board. A few days later, installed at the Sandman Hotel, Harvey heard that Terry Jo had survived. The next day, a maid at the hotel saw blood on the sheets in his room. When she couldn't open the bathroom door, her manager called the police. They forced the door open and found Harvey's bloody, lifeless body on the floor. A suicide.
A coward.
After,
Not a suicide, a
yeah,
coward.
yeah. After being pulled from the ocean, by an officer of the Greek freighter Captain Theo, Terry Jo was taken by helicopter to a Miami hospital a week after her rescue. Officials questioned Terry Jo in her hospital bed. Her story, as recounted here, disproved Harvey's account of the events. Her father, mother, brother, and younger sister, along with Dean Harvey, had been slaughtered aboard the Bluebell at the hands of Julian Harvey. Police suspected that Harvey killed his wife to collect money from her life insurance, which was worth $20,000 at the time. But if it was an accidental death, it would be doubled and he would actually get 40,000. One theory suggests that Duperrault caught Harvey in the act, prompting him to murder the Duperrault family. Terry Jo returned to Green Bay to live with her father's sister, so her aunt, and three cousins. When she was 12, she changed her name to Ter, Tere. Nearly 50 years later, in 2010, Ter finally revealed the details of the night her family was killed and her days spent drifting in open water. In Alone, Orphaned on the Ocean, which is a book that she wrote, I always believed I was saved for a reason, Ter told CBS News. If one person heals from a life tragedy after reading my story, my journey will have been worth it. So she wrote a book on like her story and everything that she endured. So the voyage cost the family $515 in 1961, which is equivalent to $5,129 today. They hired Harvey and were paying him $100 a day back then, which today would be $1,033.43 today.
Wow.
Yeah. So by November 20th, Terry Jo had regained sufficient strength to reveal to investigators the truth about what happened on the Bluebell and its passengers. So she had told police, like, obviously when she was able to, but she didn't speak publicly for at least 20 years. When she went up to the deck, she observed the bodies of her brother and mother, not far from the galley. She walked further onto the deck and observed Harry carrying a bucket. He had simply struck her and then shoved her below deck, shouting, "Get back down there." Harvey, he then entered the cabin, appeared with a rifle. Yeah, he returned, says he just kind of looked at her, returned back upstairs.
Yeah, so basically, what this means to me is he wanted to make sure she was in there, and when he saw her in there, he didn't think that she was gonna be able to get out of the boat, which is why it was
Yeah.
fine.
Ex-
No, wait, no,
ex-
because
well, so he
he
struck
saw
her
her
over
on
the
the
head with a
deck, right?
bath. He saw her on the deck, and then he struck her in the head with a bucket and shoved her down the stairs. So kind of, I guess, like trying to make sure that she was like unconscious and wasn't, able to, get herself out and that she would kind of drown, kind of thing.
But he saw her on the deck later that day because he jumped for the dinghy, right?
Yeah, but I guess like he didn't think that she would grab the other life raft or like
Or survive
I
on
guess
it.
he just thought, yeah. The other thing that she drifted at the sea for 3.5 days without food, water, or shelter. Her life raft was super small. She had to sit upright the entire ordeal, during which she repeatedly prayed for rescue. She was also adamant that the Bluebell was intact and there had been no fire on the vessel, as he claimed, and the sea was calm through the entirety of the events prior to sinking. Shortly after, she was informed that Harvey had been picked up alive 3 days prior to herself. in a life raft along with her sister's dead body, and that the body of her parents, her brother, and Harvey's wife had all been lost at sea. So Harvey also, I guess he previously survived a 1949 car accident that killed the second of his previous five wives and her mother.
I'm sorry, that's not
When
funny, but it's so ironic.
Yeah, it's like always the case, right? So in 1940, it was a 1946 Plymouth Deluxe. They had been driving, plunged off a bridge at high speed into a bayou on a rainy night, which he swam to safety, leaving his wife Joan and her mother Myrtle May Burgess Boylan to drown. The irony.
100.
And then
I
one,
honestly don't even think that that was an accident either. Like I just don't.
yeah, and then one of the yawls, the Torbatros, he had previously sunk after running into submerged wreckage of the warship San Marcos, which had sunk in 1911 in shallow water in the Chesapeake Bay. Crew members had repeatedly warned Harvey to steer clear of the wreckage, but he repeatedly navigated his vessel around the prohibited site, claiming to his crew's passengers to be attempting to read an inscription upon a buoy marking the site. His powerboat had also sunk under suspicious circumstance off the coast of Cuba in 1958. All these losses and tragedies had yielded a large insurance settlement from which he had financially benefited.
Of course he did. After multiple quote unquote accidents on a boat, how does he still have his license? And knowing that there are like suspicious circumstances around them, like oh, makes me sick.
Yeah, so that's like the story. So I'm just gonna quickly like kind of go into the aftermath a little bit here.
Yeah, for sure.
So following the loss of her family, she returned to Green Bay to live with her aunt. She would not give up the blouse and the slacks that she was wearing at the time of the rescue. So she like has hung on to those. She will not give them up.
Well, it's her only
Um,
memory of her last memory of her parents and her family, so I understand that.
yeah. So she changed her name to Tyr in part due to the refusal. She didn't want to be viewed as a victim, and due to contemporary psychological coping strategies in the early 60s, authority figures very seldom spoke with Terry Jo about her ordeal, and she did not get any trauma counseling. Consequently, she didn't speak publicly about the loss of her family and her survival ordeal for over 20 years before she spoke out publicly.
Wait,
Um,
she didn't get trauma counseling?
no, because like we're talking
Oh,
like this is in the like the 60s, right? Like the early 60s. So that was like not something that was talked about or like,
like it's not as
advocated for
widely
and stuff.
accepted. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my
So
gosh.
she later married and bore three children. As an adult, she chose to live and work close to the ocean. She's now retired and resides in Kewaunee, Wisconsin. In 2010, Terry Jo Duperrault Fassbender released her memoir, Alone, Orphaned on the Ocean. It was co-authored by psychologist and survival expert Richard Logan. The book details her family's final cruise, Harvey's murder of her family and his wife, and the 3.5 days she spent drifting upon the Cork float prior to her rescue, and her life in the years since. Some individuals are speculated as to why he didn't murder Terry Jo on the Bluebell as well. Gardner speculated that Harvey may have actually subconsciously wanted to be caught and punished for his actions. However, others have theorized that he actually intended to kill her, but when she actually dropped the rope connected to the dinghy, he was forced to dive overboard in order to prevent it from floating away without him, and thus he had to leave her alive on the sinking ship
I believe
because
that.
believing she wouldn't survive. Um,
I believe that
and
100%.
then, yeah, and then 49 years after her ordeal, she granted a television interview with morning television show host Matt Lauer, in which she stated, I think he probably thought I would go down with the ship. She also stated her belief Harvey had originally intended to discreetly murder his wife and dispose of her body, later to claim that she was lost at sea, but that she likely fought her husband, attracting the attention of the Duperrault family. Terry Jo also has also stated she does not wish for people to reflect upon her ordeal or opine, yeah, gee, that poor little girl, but rather to think of the to themselves, she has gone on with her life. She has also stated that she has always believed I was saved for a reason. If one person heals from a life of tragedy after reading my story, then my journey will have been worth it. So, there have been 4 books wrote about her, her own memoir titled Alone, Orphaned on the Ocean. There's also a book called Murder in the Tropics, the Florida Chronicles Volume 2. There's also Hampton Roads Murder and Mayhem, Charleston, South Carolina, the History Press. And then there's also Women of the Sea, Carlisle, Massachusetts. And then there was, she appeared on a September 1988 episode of the American talk show with the Oprah Winfrey Show. On that episode, she reunited with Stalionos Koutsidontis, the captain of the Greek freighter who had rescued her from sea. And then she was also on the morning television show Today. They aired an interview with her in 2010. In the interview, she discussed her survival ordeal and the theory as to why Harvey did not murder her before abandoning her on the sinking vessel. And that episode aired May 6th of 2010. So he slaughtered his wife, her entire family, and kind of needed her to get out of there. But then when the rope slipped from her grasp is likely why she ended up surviving the whole ordeal. Because if not, they probably would have just believed him and he would have been a free man.
Honestly, like some of the theories where they said like, oh, we think that he just wanted to murder his wife and say that she was lost at sea. I don't believe that. I think that he wanted to murder her for the money, yes, but I think that he would not have been able to have those people on board and survive that voting process for his story to be plausible. I don't believe that to be true. I think he felt that he needed to do the entire ship because they could say, oh, we didn't hear any noise, we didn't hear anyone walking around, we didn't hear anything, or she screamed at him stabbing her or whatever he did to kill her. Like, they don't know if she made noise, they could have heard it. He never would have done that. And like I 100% believe when they said that definitely her dropping the rope was the only reason she survived, 100%. Because he would have just assumed that she would go down with the ship unless she was like a dying baby, right? Like there's no way that you would just assume that someone's not going to survive something unless you have no other choice but to hopefully believe that to be true. So thank God she has slippery fingers. That's all I gotta say. I don't think that he would have left any of them alive. I think that he fully intended to kill everyone on board.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not really sure.
That's just my thought process. Like obviously, like we don't know everything for sure because he cowardly killed himself. That is my belief, and I don't, especially knowing that he has had suspicious accidents on other ships that he's captained. Like no doubt in my mind, and he didn't care to save any of them. So why would he care to save the rest of the family?
Yeah, I don't really understand the whole thing, especially if he wanted like the insurance money. Like it's fine to be like the sole survivor of the ship if that's even what you want to do. But like you taking your own life, you're definitely not getting the money because when they found him and brought him back, like obviously he was the only survivor and they didn't know what had happened. So like he was a free man, and it wasn't until they located her that they were able to obviously be like, yeah, like that's not what happened.
Well, I mean,
But
him killing himself was he knew that it was either he killed himself and at least he had the power to do whatever he wanted with himself, than give up the power and him be arrested and having to go to prison on 4 counts of murder or five counts of murder. So
yeah,
like it's either he goes to jail for life or he can take his life into his own hands as he took other people's lives into his own hands and killed himself, which is honestly like I don't like to say that people dying is a good thing, but him being dead, a lot of people's lives have been saved. That's literally all I can say.
100%. Considering that like his former wives died under suspicious
Yeah, yeah.
circumstances and
Weird that
stuff. And like,
his other wives. He's had what, 5 wives? So he said.
yeah, yeah,
Like, out of his
he had
5 wives,
five
a couple of
prior,
them have died of suspicious circumstances. Hmm.
yeah, five, and then his sixth died on that boat. So,
Oh, something's wrong. Something was definitely wrong.
yeah,
I've never heard of that story before. And I'm surprised I
yeah,
haven't, seeing as it was, what, the 1960s?
yeah,
Like,
yeah, 61.
I'm surprised that I never heard of that, but that is wild. I'll have to, maybe I'll go read her memoir.
Yeah, I'm actually like super curious to actually read more of her memoir of everything she endured while out there.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, like there's like the latest update for that was in 2010. I searched her name. There's no obituary that came up, so I'm assuming that she's still alive today. But yeah, not really sure. Because I mean, this all happened when she was really young, so like she's realistically probably she's a little bit younger than our grandmas. Yeah, a little bit younger than both her grandmas. So she's
Yeah,
realistically
because
not even that old
she's roughly like
at this point.
72, 73.
Yeah, and our grandmas are 75 and 80, so 81, sorry.
I did not know
So
Nanny
yeah.
was that old. Makes sense, but
Yep.
seeing as our dads are older than our moms, but
Yeah.
I never really clued into Nanny's age ever, so
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Well,
she's
your
like,
dad's only two
well,
years older than my mom. So
oh yeah, I guess so, because she's 3 older than my dad. But my dad is the youngest out of all 4 of their siblings. So,
yeah, your dad's the baby.
and like, who's the oldest? Uncle Derek?
Yeah.
Is
And then my dad,
and
and
then
then
Aunt Colleen.
her
Yeah.
sister. Yeah.
So there's probably about like, I don't know the exact ages of all of them, obviously, but
I never remember the year that they were born, other than your dad's.
I know because it's funny.
Yeah.
In the summer
Yep.
of '69, and he literally was. And it makes me giggle every time I
Yep.
hear the song.
Yep.
But
I mean, I remember my dad's now, but like I used to never remember it.
your
Like
dad is how much
ever.
older than my dad?
3 years, I think, 4 years, maybe.
Because he was born what year?
1964.
Oh,
So
64. So
before,
five
3 years
years.
after this happened.
So 5
Yeah.
years. Wow.
Yeah. And Uncle Derek's 63, and then Aunt Colleen's, I want to say 67, but I'm not 100%.
Okay, so there's 6 years difference between the oldest and the
Yeah.
youngest. That's not horrible for having 4 children. So
Yeah.
so Uncle Derek and your dad are kind of the same situation. I don't remember. Oh
As
yeah,
our moms.
yeah,
Because our
because
moms are,
Uncle Derek
my
is a
mom's
September
7,
baby too. Yeah,
yeah. And my mom's 71 and your mom's 72.
72. Yeah.
So, yeah. Anyways,
But yeah. Anyway, enough about our family's ages.
yeah,
But
pretty much.
I've never heard of that story. That's a really wild story. I have to go read that memoir, and I have to do it in
Yeah.
these 2 weeks before I go back to school because then I won't have the time.
Yeah, I'm definitely like, I haven't looked it up, but like, interesting. So,
Yeah, I'm
definitely
definitely
one I want to
interested.
check out.
I always
Yeah,
love when there's like a it's like a victim or somebody who was part of like a cult, like an ex-cult member or something that's writing it, because then you get like real accounts and it's not somebody saying somebody else's words.
yeah, it's an actual survivor of a crazy event.
Yeah, and it's not somebody interpreting another interview that somebody else had with them like 50 years ago. It's like it's actually
Yeah,
what she remembers and everything like that. So I'm definitely gonna have to go read that.
yeah, yeah.
But
And like, it's written by her and like a couple others, but like,
well, she would have worked with like professional writers and professionals who
yeah,
can put things together logically to make sense in a book format. So,
yeah.
um,
To buy that book, hardcover is $70 and paperback is 116. The audiobook is free, so I might do that.
yeah, I like to actually read it myself though. I don't like to listen because I zone
I
out too easily.
Yeah, I'm typically the same, but for that price, I'm definitely not.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I mean, that's on
I
Amazon, so it's probably like third-party sellers. I'm sure you could probably. find it at like a used bookstore. Like one of the like places I order books from, I could get it for 16.89 for a hardcover in like new condition. So and
Thrift
they're like
books?
it's a what, sorry?
Thrift books?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's that's a really good website because you got a couple books from there that they were in pretty good
They
condition.
were like super cheap. Yeah. They're like
One was from
basically
like a
for
what from
library
yeah,
books.
yeah, because it had a library sticker on the Obama one. Remember that?
Hmm.
I
Yeah, I
like
got a
when
really
I
good
buy
deal on that one.
something, like it's so stupid because like since we live in a world of like auto gratification, like when I have to wait multiple days or like a couple weeks for something to come in, I forget about it and like I'm just like, oh my god, I wish I just got it right away. So
Hmm.
like I don't like reading books that are on like a device, but I will until I can get it in person. So
Yeah.
and like right now, like I'm in between moving around, and who knows if I'm gonna be at the apartment that I have now, like if I'm gonna be there next year. So
Yeah.
like same thing with my Lego Hogwarts castle. Like I'm not gonna rebuild that until I'm in a place I know I'm gonna be for a few years.
Yeah.
So, but
For sure.
well,
For
how
sure.
was your work party last night?
It was good until I had to leave and go play baseball.
Oh right, yeah, because it was on a day that you had ball, right?
Yeah. So I hung out for with them for a few hours. I wish I could have hung out all night, but I had to go win a baseball game.
True shit.
I hit
Literally,
really well too.
literally, I finally found my blanket. So my week and a half, 2 weeks of not sleeping with a blanket, has ceased. So
Has officially ended.
yeah, and I found two extra pillows in boxes that I had from when we moved out of the house in Orangeville. So now I get more pillows and an actual blanket. So tonight I'm gonna sleep like a baby.
Fair enough.
Thank you for listening to Worst Case Macchiato. If you ever want to get in contact with us, you can either email us at worstcasemacchiato@gmail.com or you can DM us on Instagram at Worst Case Macchiato. You can either suggest a case to us that you'd like to see us cover in another episode, or if you have any updates about any cases, or if you think that we got some information wrong that we should look into, we can address it in the next episode. Just let us know on either one of those platforms, and we will try to answer everyone that we can, but sometimes time does slip away from us, but we will try our best. And like always, we'll see you in the next one.